You are looking at Joshua Nkomo's house in March 1983 when the 5th Brigade was deployed in earnest in Matabeleland North. You see, on the 5th of March 1983, soldiers raided Joshua Nkomo's house in a violent fatal operation that claimed the lives of 3 people. This is Joshua Nkomo's car, smashed and battered. This is the room in which Joshua Nkomo's driver was shot. Luckily, when the soldiers arrived, Joshua Nkomo was long gone. He had been tipped off about the raid just in time, and he went into hiding before the soldiers arrived. Days later, Joshua Nkomo was forced to flee Zimbabwe, fearing for his life. He sought refuge in Botswana and later on, London. The then Minister of Home Affairs, Herbert Ushowekunze, mocked Joshua Nkomo, alleging that he had skipped the border dressed like an old woman. ZANU-PF ministers took turns at mocking Joshua Nkomo, calling him father of dissidents. But how did the father of liberation movements in Zimbabwe end up in this situation? Cornered to the point of running away from the country he helped liberate. How did Chibwechitedza, umdala wetu, umqabuko kaNyongolo Nkomo, end up a border jumper, running away from a country he so dearly loved? Well, fellow Sadza eaters, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, vasnamalites, varikudya rice, never snama rights. Welcome to the special report. This is part 3 of the Gukurahundi series. In part 1, we talked about the ZANU-ZANLA philosophy of Maoism. In part 2, we talked about the Lancaster House Agreement and how ZIPRA and ZANLA were integrated into the Zimbabwe National Army. But today, we will look at the dissidents, the 5th Brigade, and how Dumiso Dabengwa and Lookout Masugu were arrested. Now, as a starting point, it's very important to remember that at independence, Zimbabwe had 3 separate armies. That is, the Rhodesian Army, the ZANU Army, and the ZAPU Army. Robert Mugabe's nightmare was how to create one army out of these 3 warring armies. The Rhodesian Army was already a conventional army. So the actual task was how to conventionally integrate ZIPRA and ZANLA into the new Zimbabwe National Army, which the Rhodesian Army was already a part of. And now, for purposes of this integration, ZIPRA and ZANLA soldiers were placed at assembly points all over Zimbabwe, waiting for their chance to go through training by the British military training team. These assembly points were stationed as far away from the civilian population as logistically possible. This was done in order to protect the civilian population from being caught in crossfire in the event of an armed conflict. It was also done in order to keep the soldiers away from the politically charged atmosphere. Remember, these were not ordinary soldiers. These were political soldiers, or simply put, politicians in uniform. However, the process of integrating ZIPRA and ZANLA was very slow. By December 1980, only about a quarter of the total number of guerrillas had been integrated. Keep in mind that these assembly points were mostly tent structures, not actual buildings. And furthermore, most of these ZIPRA and ZANLA soldiers were very, very young. Some of them no longer had families. Their parents had been killed and their homes burned to the ground during the war. As time went by, trouble started brewing in the assembly points. Some of the guerrillas in the assembly points got tired of inactivity. Some were just not happy with the living conditions, and some, particularly those from the ZANLA side, got impatient. Remember, during the war, they were promised that Zimbabwe would become a land of milk and honey upon attaining independence, and they thought that they would be the immediate beneficiaries of this milk and honey. However, the war was now over, yet they were still stuck in the countryside in makeshift houses made of tents. In contrast, soldiers from the Rhodesian army were never put in assembly points. They just went about their business as usual. Now you can imagine how ZIPRA and ZANLA soldiers felt. This was a national security threat. And as a result, some of the guerrillas from ZIPRA and ZANLA engaged in acts of banditry across Zimbabwe. And so, in the vain hope of addressing and correcting this problem, the government moved some of the guerrillas from the assembly points in the countryside to Chitungwiza and Entumbane. But almost immediately, there was trouble in Chitungwiza as ZIPRA and ZANLA soldiers started fighting. These fights were generally motivated by tribalism and especially fueled by reckless political statements and decisions by ZANU-PF. The situation in the military was volatile. It needed a very sober and mature handling. On one side, you had thousands of ZANLA soldiers who interpreted the ZANU-PF electoral victory in 1980 to mean that they had won the war. On the other side, you had thousands of ZIPRA soldiers, some of whom believed that the election in 1980 had been rigged by the British. Senior ZANU-PF leaders like Enos Nkala and Edgar Tekere would go to ZANLA assembly points and perpetuate the anti-ZAPU propaganda. Tekere and Nkala hated Joshua Nkomo with a passion. Robert Mugabe was relentless in his ill-timed call for a ZANU-PF one-party state. This made ZAPU and ZIPRA naturally uncomfortable, because if ZANU-PF was to go through with its plan of a one-party state, it was obvious that ZAPU would have to be removed from the picture, either through a hostile takeover or through an elimination, whether physically or politically. On the 8th of November 1980, Enos Nkala addressed a rally in Bulawayo. In this rally, he attacked Joshua Nkomo and ZAPU. He told the crowd that ZAPU was an unnecessary institution and that all opposition parties in Zimbabwe had to be crushed. The following day, Enos Nkala addressed another rally in Bulawayo. However, on this particular rally, many ZAPU supporters actually came to witness for themselves the man who was walking around the streets of Matabeleland insulting the party of their choice, ZAPU, and its leader, Joshua Nkomo. As Nkala went on with his insults, ZAPU supporters started booing him, and immediately a fight broke out between ZAPU and ZANU supporters. Riot police had to be brought in to restrain the fighters and maintain order. After order had been restored, Nkala didn't hold back. He declared that ZAPU had become an enemy of ZANU. And just to give you context, at this point, Joshua Nkomo was the Minister of Home Affairs responsible for the police. Nkala said that if the police didn't cooperate, then ZANLA troops would be called in. Imagine such recklessness from a seasoned politician who was also Minister of Finance. How do you go to the epicenter of ZAPU support and start threatening its extinction? Such recklessness from Nkala was the reason why he was the only politician to be banned from campaigning in the 1980 elections because of his hate speech. The mere fact that Enos Nkala was allowed by Robert Mugabe to spread hate speech against ZAPU is very telling on ZANU's attitude and strategy when dealing with ZAPU. All the ZANU-PF ministers who were present at this rally spoke in agreement with Enos Nkala. After the rally, the fighting continued between ZAPU and ZANU supporters, and later that day, a full-scale military battle erupted between ZIPRA and ZANLA in Entumbane. Many lost their lives. Hundreds were injured. Dumiso Davengwa and Solomon Mujuru visited Entumbane to try and quell the violence. there were many civilian deaths. This is the incident that radicalized many ZIPRA soldiers. Prior to this, they had grown increasingly frustrated with the attitude of ZANLA soldiers and ZANU politicians of treating them as losers of the War of Liberation. Like I always say, no one won the War of Liberation. There was no winner. ZIPRA did not win the war. ZANLA did not win the war. The Rhodesian army did not win the war. There is a difference between the liberation struggle and the War of Liberation. War was a component of the liberation struggle. As I always say, the liberation struggle was a combination of many factors, including war, activism, geopolitics, and dialogue. Yes, of course, I'm not stupid. I know that war was the main component of the liberation struggle. War was very crucial in putting pressure on the Smith regime. Without war, it would have taken a very long time to convince Ian Smith to give in to the idea of majority rule. Yes, war is what gave ZAPU and ZANU capital at the negotiating table at Lancaster. So therefore, I am by no means trivializing war. We are simply saying the armed struggle was a component of the liberation struggle. The liberation struggle involved war, dialogue, activism, and geopolitical factors. By the way, without geopolitical factors, it would have been almost impossible to even fight the war itself, because ZIPRA and ZANLA did not fight from Rhodesia. Their offices and military bases were located in Zambia and Tanzania, and later on, Mozambique. The Russians and the Chinese helped ZIPRA and ZANLA because they were trying to spread communism to Africa. The Americans also participated in the liberation of Zimbabwe because they were trying to stop the spread of communism in Africa. The South Africans also participated in the liberation of Zimbabwe because they were trying to influence a moderate black government that was not going to be aggressive to South Africa after independence. So you see, all these are geopolitical factors which are, or rather were, a component of the liberation struggle. Without these, ladies and gentlemen, war alone would not have been enough. So again I say, no one won the war. ZANU did not win. ZIPRA did not win. The Rhodesian army also didn't win. If ZANU had had an outright military victory, General Walls wouldn't have become the first commander of the Zimbabwe Defense Forces. If anything, they probably would have hanged him because they hated him, and for good reasons too. No military wins a war and then makes the leader of an army that it has defeated commander. It has never happened and it will never happen. But ZANLA interpreted the 1980 electoral victory to mean that they had won the war. They started treating ZIPRA as losers of the war, yet the Zimbabwe Defense Forces were being commanded by a Rhodesian commander. Many ZIPRA soldiers were compelled to take an early retirement from the National Army because of mistreatment and low prospects of promotion, while others were simply discharged or physically eliminated. Fearing for their security, some ZIPRA soldiers took matters into their own hands and deserted the Zimbabwe National Army. Some joined the ANC in South Africa, and some took up arms and went into the bush. They became dissidents. But before I go into detail about dissidents, it is important to note that ZAPU never dismissed or denied the existence of dissidents. If anything, Joshua Nkomo asked Robert Mugabe to set up a parliamentary select committee to investigate the issue of dissidents, the extent of the problem, and to establish who was sponsoring them. Robert Mugabe refused. In January 1981, Mugabe demoted Joshua Nkomo from the powerful Ministry of Home Affairs. And just to give you context, when Robert Mugabe invited ZAPU to join the Government of National Unity in 1980, Joshua Nkomo said he would only join the coalition government on the condition that ZAPU was given one of the security ministries, either defense or home affairs. Nkomo argued that this was necessary in order to convince ZIPRA that they could trust the new government. Robert Mugabe agreed. ZAPU entered the coalition government and Nkomo became the first Zimbabwean Minister of Home Affairs. So, his demotion in 1981 confirmed the fears of ZIPRA that they could not trust ZANU. Joshua Nkomo was not just a minister. He was the glue that was keeping ZIPRA and ZANLA together. Had he walked out of government after getting demoted, the country would have descended into chaos. But despite publicly registering his disappointment with the demotion, Joshua Nkomo stayed in government as minister without portfolio. Nkomo's demotion, however, led to the second ZIPRA and ZANLA war in Entumbane. ZIPRA soldiers were literally just fed up. More and more were leaving the army and often taking their weapons with them. Dissident activities increased. In August 1981, North Korean instructors arrived in Zimbabwe to train the infamous and notorious 5 Brigade. Members of this brigade were exclusively ZANLA. At the beginning of training, 5 Brigade did have a few ZIPRA members, but these were offloaded by the time the training finished. The 5th Brigade was not a part of the ZNA structure and it answered only to Mugabe. Its commander was Perence Shiri. In February 1982, Robert Mugabe fired Joshua Nkomo, Joseph Musika, Josiah Chinamano, and Jinin Tuta from government. He alleged that Joshua Nkomo was secretly stockpiling weapons as part of a plot to violently remove the government. These arms were found at 2 farms that belonged to a ZAPU company called Nitram. Joshua Nkomo denied the charges, insisting that ZIPRA's arms caches were known to the government and that ZANLA also had cached arms around Zimbabwe. You see, after the Lancaster House conference, both ZIPRA and ZANLA did hide arms in different locations in Zimbabwe as a backup plan in case the Rhodesians tried something funny. The caching of these arms was often done without the knowledge of senior political leaders. Caching arms without the knowledge of the senior leadership was common in both ZIPRA and ZANLA. You see, in 1974, during the Nari Rebellion, Tongogara organized an operation to capture the camps which had been taken over by the Nari rebels. However, there were no sufficient arms to conduct this operation, as most of these arms were actually in the captured military camps. But, to Tongogara's surprise, Solomon Mujuru actually revealed that there were arms which he had cached at a secret location before his trip to China, which I talked about in part 1 of this series. And so, these weapons which Mujuru had hidden at a secret location are the ones Tongogara used to attack the Nari rebels. Ironically, this operation to attack the Nari rebels was codenamed Operation Gukurahundi. This was the first time for the term Gukurahundi to be used by ZANLA in a military operation. One day I will make a detailed video about the Nari rebellion. Anyway, the point I was making is that the caching of arms by junior commanders without the knowledge of the senior leadership was a common practice in both ZIPRA and ZANLA. After the Lancaster House conference, both ZIPRA and ZANLA cached arms. If anything, ZANLA actually cached more arms than ZIPRA because ZANLA prepared for every possible eventuality. On the 14th of February 1982, Robert Mugabe did a press conference to address the issue of arms caches. Mugabe claimed that ZAPU had bought more than 25 farms and 30 business enterprises throughout the country. He added that these businesses and farms were being used by ZAPU for the purpose of hiding military weapons in order to start another war at an appropriate time. To quote his actual words, Robert Mugabe said, quote unquote. Dr. Nkomo is trying to overthrow my government. ZAPU and its leader, Dr. Joshua Nkomo, are like a cobra in a house. The only way to deal effectively with a snake is to strike and destroy its head. Those are the words of Robert Mugabe. But in contrast to reality though, Mugabe was going around saying ZAPU was hiding weapons in 25 different farms, when in fact weapons were only discovered in 2 farms only, Escort Farm and Hampton Farm. Both farms were owned by a company called Nitram. This company was formed by ZAPU members. After the firing of Joshua Nkomo, dissident activity multiplied. A government crackdown on ZIPRA soldiers and ZAPU leaders ensued. Many were arrested and tortured, maimed and killed. Less than a month later, on the 11th of March 1982, Dumiso Dabengwa and Lookout Masuku were arrested on charges of plotting a coup d'etat against Robert Mugabe. This became Zimbabwe's first treason trial. Their case was linked to the arms caches and dissident activities. The following month, Dabengwa and Masuku were found not guilty by the High Court and cleared of all charges. They were free to go home. But however, before they could leave the court, they were rearrested using the Emergency Powers Act. This was a law used by Ian Smith to keep Robert Mugabe himself in prison for over a decade. This piece of legislation gave the Prime Minister, through the Office of the President, powers to override decisions made by a competent court. So if the system didn't like you, you could literally rot in prison, even though you are innocent. It's the law that Ian Smith used to keep all the nationalist leaders, Joshua Nkomo included, in prison for many years. And now, in independent Zimbabwe, Dumiso Dabengwa and Lookout Masuku would spend the next 4 years in prison, despite having been declared not guilty by the High Court. And as you can imagine, the arrest and detention of Masuku and Dabengwa widened the rift between ZIPRA and ZANLA. In June 1982, a group of ZIPRA soldiers serving in the ZNA conducted a failed attack on the residences of Mugabe and Emerson Kala in Harare. In July 1982, 6 Western tourists were kidnapped, and these abductions were attributed to the dissidents. And although Joshua Nkomo spoke out publicly against the dissident violence almost from the time it began, his words had no apparent impact. I mean, how do you control a leaderless rebellion? ZAPU didn't deploy the dissidents. These dissidents rebelled of their own accord. Furthermore, ZIPRA was no longer a responsibility of ZAPU. ZIPRA was now a responsibility of government, particularly the integrated ZIPRA element. There are countless videos, even on YouTube, of Joshua Nkomo denouncing dissident activities, but unfortunately, his words fell on deaf ears. These were rebels, ladies and gentlemen, and people often overlook the fact that these rebels didn't just rebel against government, they also rebelled against their commander-in-chief, Nkomo. It wasn't uncommon for soldiers to rebel against their political leaders. In 1971, a group of young ZAPU guerrillas led by Walter Mtimkulu kidnapped 21 ZAPU political and military leaders. In 1974, a group of ZANLA guerrillas led by Thomas Nari and Badza captured 19 political and military leaders of ZANU, including the wife of Tongogara and 3 kids. And of course, I'm sure by now, we all know that junior army commanders of ZANLA got rid of the first political leader of ZANU, Ndabaningi Stole. So, I said all this to show you that it wasn't uncommon for a section of both ZIPRA and ZANLA soldiers to rebel against their senior leadership. So it therefore shouldn't surprise anyone that none of the dissidents listened to Joshua Nkomo when he called for an end to the dissident violence. But Many in ZANU-PF viewed the lack of effect of Nkomo's words as a confirmation that ZAPU was behind the growing dissident violence. ZANU's paranoia was especially fueled by the activities of operatives from apartheid South Africa. You see, around the time when the 6 Western tourists were kidnapped, South African operatives set off explosives at the Air Force base in Gweru. 13 aircrafts were either damaged or destroyed. Amongst the damaged equipment were 3 expensive and recently delivered brand new jets from Britain. The activities of South African operatives increased over time, and sometimes these activities were attributed to the dissidents. Dissident activity became more prevalent by the end of 1982. They attacked cars, buses, and trains and destroyed government construction equipment. They seized several hostages and killed 6 whites. The South African government also took advantage of the situation, and its operatives committed many acts of sabotage and banditry in the name of the dissidents. Remember, apartheid South Africa was on a destabilization campaign in Zimbabwe and Mozambique. The 5th Brigade was fully deployed in earnest in January 1983 in Matabeleland North and Matabeleland South in 1984. And as I mentioned before, the 5th Brigade answered only to Robert Mugabe, and its commander was Perence Shiri. They called him Black Jesus because he could determine whether you live or die. The 5th Brigade's mission wasn't just about dealing with dissidents. Part of its mission was also to destroy the political structures of ZAPU. ZANU had made up its mind. ZAPU had to be crushed and destroyed. Enos Nkala's prophecy was coming to pass. But crushing ZAPU also included its supporters. And who were its supporters? The entire Matabeleland region. ZANU had failed completely to win seats in Matabeleland. Nkomo and ZAPU were overwhelmingly popular in this part of Zimbabwe. So, this violence was in the vain hope of transferring the ZAPU support to ZANU. In fact, Robert Mugabe said the following at a rally in Njombe. He said, "When men and women provide food for dissidents, when we get there, we eradicate them. We do not select who we fight, because we cannot tell who is a dissident and who is not." Those are the words of Robert Mugabe. In 1985, at a press conference, Mugabe also said that in order for the nation to move forward, ZAPU had to be eliminated. He said, "Without ZAPU, the people of Matabeleland will fall in line." It's very clear. The 5th Brigade was a tool that they used to whip the people of Matabeleland into line. This notorious brigade was conducting mass beatings, killings, torture, rape, and burning of villages. Some were even burned alive. Pregnant women had their stomachs cut and sliced through with knives. Clearly, these excesses had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with suppressing the dissidents. If you watch part 1 of this series, you will remember that I talked about the ZANU-ZANLA philosophy of Maoism. You will remember how I took time explaining Maoism and how Mao rose to power. You see, in Maoism, violence is a necessary tool in establishing a social and political order that is desirable to the rulers. In Maoism, the end justifies the means. The idea that if you think that something is justifiable enough, then it doesn't matter how you attain it. Mao himself killed millions of people in pursuit of an absolute communist state. And now, his students in ZANU-PF were doing the same in pursuit of a one-party socialist state. A state of emergency was soon effected in Matabeleland North. People were basically caged in. No one was allowed to leave. No one was allowed to come in. there was untold suffering. Some even ran out of food supplies. Matebeleland was burning. And that ends part 3 of this Gukurahundi series. In part 4, we will look at how Joshua Nkomo announced to the world the Gukurahundi killings and the backlash he received from ZANU-PF. We will also look at the death of General Lookout Masuku, the assassination of Jinin Tuta, who had been fired from government together with Joshua Nkomo in 1982. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.